Stories from the Continent with Haddy and Ndure.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Stories from the Continent with myself, Haddy Ndure. I am extremely honored to bring you today's guest. He is recognized as one of the leading politicians in Seychelles. Jean-Paul Adam has served in several ministerial capacities for the government of Seychelles before joining the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in 2020. Over the past decade, maybe more, maybe a little less, we'll find out soon, he has been working incredibly hard to shine a light on building a better Africa, particularly through the green and blue economy. Before joining the UN, His Excellency Jean-Paul Adam served in three ministerial roles as the Minister of Health and Social Affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Finance, Trade, and the Blue Economy. He has been instrumental in promoting the implementation of the two economies in Seychelles. So today we'll discuss what the blue and green economies are and what can the rest of Africa learn from Seychelles. Jean-Paul, thank you so much for talking to us on Stories from the Continent.
Thank you very much, Haddy. It's great to be with you and to have the opportunity to talk about these issues, which I think are very important for all African countries.
Thank you. So before we delve into the conversation, I want us to learn a bit more about you. You were Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Trade. You've served your countries, like I said, in different capacities. What made you want to move into your current role as a director at the UNECA?
Well, it was a sense that in the efforts that are being made towards achieving sustainability, there's so much that you can do at the national level, but there's also the wider systemic conversations which are happening at the global level. And one of the things that I was always trying to do as a representative of Seychelles was to make sure that these issues were heard from the perspective of a small island developing state. But I think also the context of small islands is that they are quite often the canary in the coal mine. A lot of the environmental impacts that are associated with climate change are felt there first. But also in terms of opportunities, a lot of the potential solutions can also be adopted quicker because it's a smaller population. It's more rapid to sort of try things out. And I wanted to try and bring some of this experience to a wider group with the opportunity to look at the systemic level how we could foster the principles of a green or blue economy, and to make clear that Seychelles is not perfect. It's my home. I'm very proud of the things that have been done there. There's still a lot to do, but a lot of the things, and this I think goes for Africa as well. It's a question of determining what are the things that will have the most impact in terms of people's well-being. And I think it's surprising to see that actually the majority of those things will actually correlate with respect for the environment. And the problem is that sometimes we're too short-termist in terms of our planning. But if we look at the bigger picture, we find that investing in the environment is actually the best way to also improve people's livelihoods and people's lives on a daily basis.
Now, thank you, Jean-Paul. You've touched on Seychelles, being a small country, and it is. It has a population of under 100,000, but it also is a high-income country, and actually one of the only high-income countries in Africa. So I'm going to start, first of all, by asking you your management of the coronavirus pandemic. How has Seychelles been coping with the shock to the economy that came with COVID-19?
Well, it has been challenging, and I think the main issue is that, again, I think even though it would be slightly different in each African country, the issue that most African countries have is a narrow resource base. This is more acute in small islands. So, for example, in a country like Seychelles, tourism has a disproportionate share of GDP, almost 40%, but the knock-on impact is even bigger. And this means that COVID, for example, completely disrupted tourism. Tourism ground to a complete halt in 2020, which has dramatically reduced tax receipts, and affected the economy dramatically with huge losses in terms of GDP. And so 2021 has started a bit better, and there's been a reopening of the economy based on the fast pace of vaccinations. Over 60% of people have been vaccinated, which has allowed Seychelles to open up to tourism again, and that has improved the flows. But that comes also with the challenge of a rise again in infections, because of course vaccination ensures that there are less complications, but it doesn't prevent the spread of the virus. And I think these are the challenges that most African countries are going to face, is that as we implement vaccination, we still need to manage the virus on a daily basis, and we need to address it in terms of its socioeconomic impacts, which are going to be felt long term. And we're seeing that in most countries where large parts of the economy have been affected, and African countries don't have the reserves to tap into that, or even the cheap credit to tap into that, let's say, OECD countries have been able to tap into.
So I'm glad you talked about tourism, but I want to know more because, as we know, Seychelles is becoming globally recognized and renowned, as a leading tourism economy. And like you said, a nation that heavily relies on tourism. And tourist activities, of course, around the world have drastically declined over the past 14 months. We have seen, though, countries in Europe, starting with the UK, actually, restarting international travel from this week. Unfortunately for us in the UK, Seychelles is on the red list, which means travel is currently at the highest restriction levels. But, you've talked about reopening the economy and reopening your borders. Where are the other tourists coming from?
Well, there have been a few. I mean, I think the key in terms of all the restart of travel around tourism in the era of COVID is about countries understanding the relative risks and, where possible, establishing travel corridors. So Seychelles had started with countries like Israel, for example, and there were also some opportunities that had been developed with Eastern Europe, and and I think a lot of the tourists that came were also people who'd already been vaccinated from different areas. I think very interestingly, there's also been an increase in tourism from African countries, and recognizing that Seychelles is a country that doesn't apply any visas, for example. So there has been some positives there, but obviously, as cases increase, different countries may take measures, like the UK, and it's completely understandable. As you see cases rise, you may wish to put certain restrictions on travel to those countries, because obviously, if you're on a downward trend, you don't want that to change. And I think the tourism industry has to adapt to these realities of these peaks and troughs and these situations. Of course, it's very disruptive in a country that is so dependent on it. And some of the work that we're doing now in the Economic Commission for Africa is precisely about trying to support countries, how they manage these downturns, and also, despite the fiscal challenges that go with that, how they can actually invest more longer term to actually reduce the impact in the future and build more resilience.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. I'm interested also in your healthcare system. One of the biggest struggles the African continent faces is healthcare. And I mentioned at the start that you're a former Minister of Health. What were some of the challenges you faced in that role and then hopefully overcame?
Well, the challenge, I think, for most African countries is is how do you invest, and you need to invest in everything at the same time. You need to deal with preventative care, which brings a huge benefit, but at the same time, you also need to provide more advanced care, which is extremely costly. And this is the challenge that most countries face. Seychelles took the route quite a long time ago of heavily investing in primary care, and I think that has borne dividends. According to the WHO, I think Seychelles had the best outcomes in terms of their health system from the last report that I saw. And that's not to say that there are not challenges, and in particular the issues around investing in high-level tertiary care are particularly difficult in a small population where you don't have the economies of scale. So if you have to invest in very expensive equipment, for example, you have to spread that cost over a smaller tax base. So even though the income per capita may be high, the cost per capita is also higher. You can't make a smaller machine just because your country is smaller. An MRI still costs the cost of an MRI, and you've got to divide that cost by the population. So we still have the challenges of having to send people to other jurisdictions for sort of more advanced treatment, and this is a problem that's faced by a number of African countries. And some of the solutions that we're trying to achieve are reducing the cost for African countries in general by, for example, pooling costs. And one of these initiatives has been the potential pool procurement of essential medicines in Africa. And Seychelles, when I was Minister of Health, we started that process, and the UNECA is now continuing those discussions, and that brings a double advantage. It reduces costs for the procurement of medicines, but it also creates a stronger internal market for the production of medicines and supplies. And also around the response to COVID-19, the UN Economic Commission for Africa has partnered with the Afrexim Bank and some other partners to create the African Medical Supplies Platform, which has been an online platform allowing procurement teams from across the continent to better access the purchase of equipment and medicines to tackle the virus. And I think this gives us a very interesting template going forward, where we can reduce costs for Africa by doing a lot more of this kind of procurement, but also looking at the production of medical equipment and medicines on the continent to better supply the needs.
Thank you. Really interesting to hear that, Seychelles is kind of facing similar challenges as the rest of, many African countries are. So we'll now talk about the blue and green economies. I know in your previous work as the Minister of Finance, Trade and Blue Economy between 2015 and 2016, you were very focused on diversifying the economy of your nation by tapping into the potential of the ocean. So I know you've been asked this question for many years now, but I'd like you to treat it, please, if you can, as a new concept to many of our viewers in the African continent. So if you could please tell us what it means, how Seychelles is using the ocean for sustainable development, and how perhaps other African countries can start thinking in this way and emulate this.
Well, the conversation around a blue economy started on the simple statement of fact that Seychelles has only 454 square kilometers of land, but 1.3 million square kilometers of ocean. So Seychelles actually has the second largest exclusive economic zone in Africa after South Africa. So, and to put that in perspective, the ocean space that belongs to Seychelles would be equivalent to 3 times the size of Germany. So it's a very small island nation, but but you could say also a large ocean nation. And it was a recognition that a lot of the future perspectives of growth will actually derive from where the resources actually are. And there are a lot more resources that are associated with the sea. And even our existing economy based on tourism and fisheries depends a lot on the health of the natural environment associated with the ocean. So the blue economy is essentially a way of looking at sustainable development and recognizing the intrinsic value of the natural environment from which this wealth and benefit is derived. So the blue economy is a translation. So people may have heard of the green economy, which very loosely is about moving towards a more sustainable model of development. And the blue economy is its translation in the context of recognizing the opportunities from an oceanic perspective. And African countries have huge opportunities to really maximize those opportunities, because in the past, African countries perhaps have tended to look at the ocean as looking at their borders as ending at the beach. And so there's a whole wealth of opportunity to be explored in the oceanic spaces, which requires the appropriate regulation, it requires the appropriate capacity building, and it requires investment in the long term. And the blue economy is also about recognizing that this can't just be an indiscriminate investment. It has to recognize the basic value of natural capital, which is stored within the ocean. And also that in many cases, and we look at fisheries, for example, which in Africa are unfortunately too often dominated by distant fishing nations. There are very few African-owned industrial fisheries, and these are having huge impacts in terms of the natural environment and actually depleting the opportunities for the creation, for example, of small and medium enterprises that would be African-owned, which could be more productive in terms of providing incomes for families on the continent itself. So I think the blue economy is an opportunity which has particularly been evident to small island states, but it's one which is open to all African countries to make use of a resource which has perhaps been dominated by third parties, but with a real opportunity for Africa to claim ownership and also develop the oceanic spaces in a sustainable way, which maximizes employment and opportunities.
Thank you. I'm just thinking, as great as all of this sounds, we also know that the ocean is under pressure, under threat from many other factors, including plastic pollution and the climate crisis. So, help us understand a bit better some of the challenges that are facing the blue economy.
Well, I would place climate change as the number one challenge. And we've looked at COVID-19, how that has completely disrupted our lives, not only in Africa, but across the world. But climate change, and particularly in Africa, is having a huge impact. The studies done by the UNECA, and which we've mentioned in our recent Green Recovery report, have shown that in many instances, African countries are spending up to 9% of GDP, and on average are spending 5% of GDP responding to climate-related natural disasters. And I'm sure, we can't go a year in the news without hearing about the impact of a cyclone on an African country, or the impact of drought, or the impact of desert locusts. All of these elements have climate links, and they are costing real money in terms of the impact on African countries. And this is the same with the ocean. Climate change is impacting on coral reefs in terms of bleaching, and this has a huge impact on the ability of fisheries to rejuvenate and to provide long-term fish stocks for our fisheries sectors, and the vital source of protein that provides for Africa. So climate change is, and when we look at COVID, COVID has had a huge impact, perhaps in a little bit more direct and immediate way. Climate change has been more of a slow burn, but the impact is as dramatic, and in the long term will be even more destructive and more and will affect our way of life even more fundamentally. Hence the need to build resilience immediately. And the whole approach that we're taking is how to build back better, to build forward better, responding to COVID-19, but also building that climate resilience by investing now.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. And is the blue economy a little bit like agriculture for many other sub-Saharan countries? I have said so many times on this show that we aren't using agriculture and our land, our climate to its fullest potential. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a very interesting analogy, and you could absolutely say that Africa needs to make better use of its land as part of a green economy, and that means efficient use of land, where we can get more productivity, for example, for each acre that is under agricultural production. And we can also look at ways that we can undertake climate smart agriculture that is in a more sort of symbiotic process with nature. And we can see that, for example, there's a lot of forestry-based agriculture that is being developed. There are countries that are successfully implementing projects where they're rehabilitating forest areas and creating livelihoods that are linked with either agricultural products that come from those forests or from sustainably sourced timber, for example. And the blue economy is a way of looking at the oceanic space in the same way. How can you enhance the productivity of the marine space that you theoretically can control, and do so in a way which enhances its future value? And in the context of Seychelles, for example, that started with a marine spatial plan, where we looked at all of the different activities that could take place in a given area. And it's the same principle for land. It's about planning correctly, knowing what industries and what activities can take place in different areas, and then making sure that the long-term impact serves to enhance the natural environment, which ultimately creates the opportunity, rather than depleting it, which then leads to diminishing returns.
Thank you. So back again to the blue economy. Are you involving and introducing young people to these initiatives?
Absolutely. This is it's a key element of, firstly, the work that the ECA is doing through the African Regional Forum on Sustainable Development, which is an annual forum. It took place this year in a hybrid format in Congo, Brazzaville. And that involved a lot of outreach to young people around different themes. This year was challenging because of the COVID pandemic. We couldn't bring large numbers of young people to participate in the event in person, but they participated online. We had, for example, a short stories competition where we were overwhelmed with the number of people who made submissions and showed how much awareness there is among young people about the importance of the environment. But obviously, the pandemic is, I would say, perhaps more disruptive for young people, and hence the need for us to find new ways to reach them on topics such as the blue economy. Traditional educational outreach doesn't have the capacity in Africa to deal with these issues in the same way that perhaps the OECD countries have done so. So we need to think about more innovative ways. We need to build grassroots partnerships that allow people to really bring young people into the concept of the blue economy. And I think that's really about empowering the transfer of local knowledge, whether it be fishermen, for example, speaking to young people, passing on their traditional knowledge, or other similar kind of connections that can take place.
What about women? What about women? Are they involved in pushing forward the blue economy and heading those projects?
Absolutely. Across Africa, the majority of people involved, for example, in the selling of fish products, tend to be women, even if fishermen or people involved in the actual fishing are still dominated by men. They still play a key role, and they are the ones that are the most adversely impacted in terms of their incomes when there is disruption. And going forward, the focus in Africa is about improving the value chain. And whenever there is a improvement across the value chain, whether it be in the agricultural sector, fisheries sector, you will tend to find that the benefits are shared a little bit more equally, and that there is more engagement and more opportunity for the creation of small and medium enterprises, quite often who are led by women. But there needs to be a very conscious outreach. There needs to be attention given to the issues that may prevent women from participating actively, which may include access to finance, for example, and also sometimes very simple logistical things such as access to markets, to cold chains, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. And you talked a bit about conferences and summits that you've organized. When you speak to leaders from other African countries, is there an appetite for the sustainable way of developing the continent?
I think that the majority of African countries have really embraced the principles of sustainable development and of a green economy or blue economy. In January this year, the African Union adopted a green stimulus program, which outlined 12 priority areas for investment for African countries to be able to build forward better. And these areas focused on ensuring that there's climate resilience, and that meant rehabilitation of the natural environment, climate smart agriculture, and it also involved the development of the blue economy, looking at the sustainable ways in which we can derive benefit from the oceans. We've also had the African Union Blue Economy Strategy, which was adopted in 2020. And so I think there is strong leadership from within the continent, and there is increased realization of the importance of natural capital in the continent. For example, at the African Regional Forum on Sustainable Development, the president of Congo underlined that the Congo Basin holds up to 3 years worth of global emissions in the Congo peatlands, which are shared among several countries over the Congo Basin. And the importance, therefore, of protecting such areas, not only for the benefit of people who live there, but for the whole planet, but the importance as well that we can link that protection with the creation of livelihoods so that people have something that they can benefit from and can see the advantage of protecting the environment. And the problem is that in many cases, when people are depending on the environment for subsistence, there can be long-term impacts which if not addressed correctly, can be very detrimental.
Thank you. There's also something else I'd like you to talk us through. A number of African countries are seeking to follow Seychelles' example of turning national debt to protected areas known as the Blue Bond Nature Debt Swap. I must admit, prior to this interview and doing the research, I'd never heard of this concept myself. So again, perhaps not a widely discussed topic or known topic, but very fascinating. Tell us more about this.
Well, the challenge that African countries face is that they have very limited access to capital. We tend to think of Africa as a very poor continent, and of course, yes, the majority of low-income countries are in Africa, but the majority of countries in Africa are actually now middle income. So the number of countries that in the past would have had access to concessional resources no longer have that same access. So they're able to borrow some resources from concessional institutions like the World Bank or the African Development Bank, but they also need to borrow commercially. And the problem is that when they borrow commercially, they are paying a risk premium which is associated with Africa. So a country like South Africa, which might be one of the best rated African countries, will pay probably 5 to 6 times more in terms of interest than a European country or an OECD country that has a similar credit rating. And that means that the cost of capital is high, and it means that debt tends to go up faster in African countries. And even countries that have relatively low debt, the pace of debt increase is dramatic. And we've seen that the average debt to GDP ratio in Africa is now over 60%, and it's rising fast as a consequence of the pandemic. So what are the solutions that we can deal with this debt? And one of the solutions is how can we reschedule or restructure the debt, but also create new funds for investment. And that's where debt swaps come in. So debt swaps means identifying debt that a country may already have, which is perhaps not sustainable, and proposing to the creditors that they accept to give a certain level of forgiveness, but not the whole debt, and the portion of forgiveness, and then rescheduling it also perhaps over a longer period. But the country agrees to continue paying or committing the same amount to service the debt, but the part that's saved gets invested in climate resilience. So if we take the Seychelles example, Seychelles essentially bought back about $22 million worth of its debt. And a portion of that was on better terms, so there was a saving. And the saving was continued to be paid by the Seychelles government, but rather than paying it to a creditor, it was paid to create a marine protected area. So there are many different ways in which this could be done in different African countries. It doesn't actually have to be done for a protected area. It could be done for investment in renewable energy, for example, or it could be done to source vaccines. Although because it takes a bit of time to structure, perhaps vaccines would not be the best example. But the idea would be that you can take a lot of Africa's existing debt, restructure it for reinvesting in building climate resilience. And the advantage of climate resilience as well is that it improves the perspectives for future growth. So if you invest in marine protected areas where you're rehabilitating mangroves, for example, you will see an increase in the fisheries catch. A recent study by the Marine Protected Areas of the United States showed that for every 5% additional area brought under protection would increase catches by 20% within 5 years. So, of course, there are some caveats. It has to be very targeted. The area, you can't just protect any area. It has to be areas that are important for fish reproduction. But the point being is that you can repurpose debt for investing in climate resilience. And the principles of blue bonds and green bonds would be Again, African countries being able to borrow on international capital markets, but at much cheaper rates, on the condition that they are investing in areas that create climate resilience. And we're working with a number of African countries through the UNECA to support them if they would wish to go down that route.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that so brilliantly. I feel like I'm back in school now. Thank you, Jean-Paul. I'd like us to talk a bit more about farming and agriculture. Most farmers and farming in general in the continent is looked down on. I don't know what the situation is like in Seychelles, but I think the question everyone has been asking over the past few years, especially for poorer African countries, is number one, how do we transform, a smallholder farmer to become a commercial farmer to ensure, one, food security, and two, that they can make a living out of farming?
I think you've touched on one of the biggest problems that our continent faces. We too often don't ask the right questions about where our food is coming from. 25% of all of our rice imports are currently coming from India, for example, and we expect to have disruptions that are associated with the very unfortunate wave of coronavirus infections that are happening there. And the solutions involve investing particularly in climate smart agriculture, and this involves both at the large scale, and that means green industrialized investments, but it's also in terms of investments for smallholder farmers. But the key transformative aspect will be the trade architecture that allows the people involved in the food production sectors to benefit. And we have to ensure through the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has just started implementation, that we're having a race to the top and not a race to the bottom. And that means recognizing the real cost of production for smallholder farmers and looking at the realities also of the impacts on the environments. And also looking at the impact in terms of unfortunately, too often there's dumping that takes place in terms of agricultural products on the continent, and there are also tactics that distort the market, including in the fisheries sector, for example, subsidies. And there's significant work happening now at the World Trade Organization to address the issue of subsidies, so that there is a fairer market for producers. And I think that's where we need to focus the effort, ensuring that there are standards that are environmental, that are locked into the African Continental Free Trade Area, and that we're looking in particular that we are creating livelihoods for these people. Our Green Recovery Report has shown that by investing in climate smart agriculture, you can get a much better return than by investing in more fossil fuel based agricultural development. And you can pair this as well with nature-based investments, which actually reinforce or rehabilitate the natural environment, including, as I mentioned, so through agroforestry and similar types of investment.
Thank you. I think for me, from the conversations that I've had on and off the show, about agriculture, it seems that, and I think you'll agree with me, that tackling agriculture in the continent and, kind of promoting this idea of eating what we grow is very much about shifting mindsets and, changing the underlying norms that encourage this culture of dependency on the West. How do we do that, Jean-Paul? How do you change mindsets?
Well, I think there's multiple ways in which it should be done. Firstly, there has to be sensitization. People have to be aware. There has to be more awareness of where your food is actually coming from and what this means in terms of your health, because we're also seeing in Africa a rise in health issues that are associated with poor nutrition. So it's not necessarily a lack of calories, but the increase in empty calories and of processed foods, which are having a huge impact on people's health. And that's the awareness building side of things. And you've got the actual trade architecture, and this is where the AFCFTA comes in, where a lot of effort needs to be made. And then it's the investment as well, because too often the agricultural sector is subsistence, and people do it because they have no choice. And we need to create the environment whereby people are actually able to invest in the long term, not just for one season, but people are able to see in the long term. And that's linked to the trade architecture, because there needs to be certainty. If we produce these products, there will be a market for it, and it will be able to reach those markets in good condition. So I think those are the key elements that we need to address.
And in terms of the raising awareness, does education have a role to play in this?
Absolutely. And that includes through formal educational processes, through schools, as well as through government sensitization programs. But it also involves more informal means, and I think this is where it's about better connecting, for lack of a better word, better connecting elites in urban areas with the realities of production in the rural areas. And also it's about investing in infrastructure in these rural areas, because if you can't have access to electricity in the areas where food are being produced, then the quality of the food being produced will not meet the needs of the market. So in terms of the starting points, and this is coming out in our Green Recovery report. So food is really basic. It's one of the key areas, but it goes side by side with investment in energy to ensure that you are multiplying the effect of any potential investment.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. It seems you're really putting your weight behind long-term solutions. Looking to the future now, do you see a potential partnership between, lower and middle-income countries and Seychelles? And if yes, what do you think those partnerships will look like?
Well, I think there is an increasing understanding in Africa that the issue of classification of low income, middle income, and higher income are relatively arbitrary, and they're also not necessarily based around the realities of citizens. For example, we've seen through the pandemic that there have been places where countries that are nominally middle income, but you've had people that have been completely disenfranchised in terms of their ability to earn a living, even if they are living in what is technically a wealthy country or wealthier country.
Very true.
And the consensus, which I think is more and more emerging, not only in Africa, but I would say across the world, is to look less at the issue of GDP per capita, meaning dividing the total amount of money in a country by the number of citizens, which creates an often distorted view of real prosperity, to rather look at development through a lens of vulnerability, and that means identifying the real sources of vulnerability of a country and building resilience. And I think that's where there's real opportunity for partnership. Is that resilience is something which is universal. It's something which all countries need, but it looks a little bit different in different countries. So some countries will be more prone to cyclones. Other countries may be more prone to droughts. Other countries may have other issues to their vulnerability. And the reality is that the building of resilience also requires investment in slightly different ways. But there are common areas that emerge, and that's one of the strong outcomes of our report. You need a strong energy infrastructure. You need to invest in food security, and you need to ensure that you are, in the long term, also protecting the natural environment, which ultimately is the source of wealth creation for our countries.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. And this is something that struck me when I was planning this interview, is that there are many Africans who don't actually realize that Seychelles is an African country. So besides the geographical placement, do you consider yourselves African?
We do. I mean, Seychelles was pre-independence joined the movements in terms of asking for African independence for African countries. So there has been a long tradition of people looking to the continent for in terms of the political future of the country, and also there are long historical links. You had a number of people that left Seychelles, and usually the first port of call was Mombasa. So you had quite a few people who worked, for example, in Kenya and in Eastern Africa over a number of years. And there has been, I think, an increasing understanding in Africa of the value that all Africa's islands bring to the continent. And Kwame Nkrumah, when he spoke of African independence, spoke of Africa and its islands, recognizing the intrinsic value of the wider realm that was associated with the ocean and the potential that Africa would have by looking at this. So I think it's a two-way process. Africa benefits from Seychelles, and Seychelles benefits from being part of Africa. And there's never been a question about being part of any other geographic grouping.
Thank you. Final question for me now. Jean-Paul, imagine we have this interview again in a year or two from now. What changes would you have liked to see happen on a local and continental level in regards to the blue and green economies that we have discussed?
I think we need to see a shift by African countries themselves in terms of the patterns of investment. So we recognize there are huge challenges about the mobilization of resources in the current environment. But the work that we've done has shown that you get the best impact by investing firstly in energy, and renewable energy creates more jobs than fossil fuel-based energy. So investing in energy. Secondly, investing in food systems. And thirdly, investing in rehabilitation of nature. And all of those elements actually, and perhaps surprisingly, actually create more jobs than going down the route of, for example, extractives. And this is one of the issues that I think Africa has to address in terms of the paradigm shift, because the dependence in the past on a few extractive industries has not created the value addition and the jobs that we would have wished across the continent. There has to be a building of stronger value chains, and those stronger value chains start with those three elements that I've already mentioned. And we're not necessarily going to see the results immediately, but we need to see African countries themselves taking the lead on this. And we're starting to see it. The African Green Stimulus Program that was adopted in January is the first step down this route.
Thank you again, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much for your time. I wish you the very best with all the excellent work you're doing in the Seychelles. Thank
you, Haddy, and thank you for being part of the sensitization that needs to take place about these issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Thank you.